We're gonna build a comment moderation dashboard that uses AI to put the worst comments in the trash. And we're gonna do the whole thing in minutes, so stick around. Internal tools don't get prioritized. Instead, teams end up running copy-pasted commands in production. And we know it's a bad idea, but we gotta ship features first, right? Internal tools come later, but later never comes. And that's where this video's sponsor, Airplane, comes in. Airplane is a development suite that lets your team build internal tooling really fast. I've been working with it for a while, and it's honestly quicker to set up views and dashboards in Airplane than it would be to copy paste all of your commands into a runbook and try to document them and train people on how to use it. Just try it, it's great. Today, we'll build an Airplane dashboard to moderate the comments in an app. We'll add an OpenAI layer on top to automatically moderate any vulgar or abusive comments. I'm Jason Langsdorf. Let's learn something new.
Let's get started by setting up our account. So you can either sign up or log in. And in either case, you can use your email or Google single sign-on. Now that I've got the account open, to work locally, we're going to need the Airplane CLI. So I'm going to copy this command here, head over to my terminal and run it. To make setup easier, we're going to use a starter repo. I'm using the GitHub CLI to clone this. We're going to get the start branch of the Airplane content moderation repo in the Learn with Jason org. Inside this library, you can see that we've got just a little bit of boilerplate here. So we've got a package.json, we've got a tsconfig, we have a gitignore, and then we have this airplane.yaml, which only specifies the node version. We're going to be using node 18. So if you need to, make sure you update to be using node 18. And then we've got this example app. So we'll ignore this example app for now. We're going to come back to that later once we've got everything built. Start the local dev server by running airplane dev, and this is going to ask you to log in the first time that you use it. And once you're logged in, it will show you that you're running the studio. So we can press enter to open the studio. The studio that opens looks like a website, but it is running locally. You can see here that it's pulling up this localhost at 7447. It is going to modify files in your local file system as you work, which is a really nice developer experience. Keeps things low code without removing your access to the code. There are 4 sections that we're going to be paying attention to today. The first is the Explorer. This will show us the tasks and views that we build. We've also got access to resources. You can bring your own database and other things into Airplane as resources. They provide this demo Postgres database that we're going to be working with. There's also config if you need to set something like an API key or secret. And then you have environment variables if you want to override something locally. Our first task is to get the database set up so that we can store and moderate comments. So we're going to create a new task. There's this new button up here, or you've got shortcuts if you want them. We want to create a new task of the SQL type. And then you don't have any rules around how you name things. I like to group them by what the thing is about, so comments, and then what we're doing with it. So in this case, we're going to do a database reset. So I'm going to create that. And then this will show me some details here. So let's update the name to be human readable. Can add a description here. And then under the build settings, let's choose the DemoDB as the database we want to use. Then we got a few queries. First one, we'll drop the table if it exists. Then we want to create the table again, and we're going to be able to store an ID, a comment, and whether or not it's flagged, and we'll insert 4 comments to start to approved to flagged. In our code, we can see that everything we just did is automatically updated into this file, and then our query ends up in this comments DB reset right here. So anything that we're doing in the UI will be updated in our files, and that's what makes this trackable in Git and just makes it really nice to work with because we don't have to remember this YAML structure. We just have to work with the UI, and it's going to set up the YAML for us. Now to run this, we can click this execute task button and we'll see that it has succeeded, runs 1 query, 2 queries, 3 queries, and then we can see that it has 4 rows that came out of that. And now we have comments in our database. We can't see them yet, so let's add another task. We've got a plus button here, or we can click up here again and add a task, another SQL task. And this one is going to be called comments list all. And inside here, we can give it a name that's human readable and add a description, choose the demo DB, and then update the query to grab all the fields from our comments database, and then we'll just group them by ordering by whether or not they're flagged. We can execute that task and we get output that shows here are the 4 comment rows that we've saved. We can see that 2 of them are not flagged and 2 of them are flagged. We need the ability to list all comments, and for moderation, we're going to need to be able to see just the approved and just the flagged comments. And for each of these, if you want to see any runs, you can either run it fresh or you can look at a recent run without having to run it again, which can be good if you've got heavy queries libraries, and you don't necessarily need the data to be fresh. You just need to verify what it looks like. Next up, let's create our first view. And so the way this is going to work is the same as a task, except we're going to choose view this time. And we will call this comment moderation dashboard. And we're going to give it a description. Creating a view is going to set up this comment moderation dashboard, and we need to make sure that we have installed our dependencies. So if you haven't already, run yarn or npm install or whatever your preferred package management library is, and then make sure that Airplane Dev is still running. Inside, we can see that Airplane is providing us with a component library so that we've got common things like callouts, headings, links, stacks. There are a whole lot of options here. Airplane provides a whole component library, so we've got tons of common things that you're going to need to build a dashboard. For our purposes, we'll be relying heavily on the table, which is going to allow us to show those comment entries both in approved and flagged states. So the way these components work is we use anything we want from the component library, or we can write custom components if we want to. And then we have our actual React component, which is going to render the view. And down below, we've got this exported airplane.view, which includes a kind of front matter, the definition, so the slug name and description. This is similar to what's in the YAML file. And then we add this component as our second argument. So for our purposes, we want to replace all of this with a simpler stack. And to make this work, we need to update our imports. We can get rid of the ones we're not using anymore. The heading stays the same. It just takes some text. The table takes a few things. So the title is just a heading. It's going to show up at the top of the table so that it describes what's inside of it. The default page size shows us how many rows we want to be visible. Hidden columns means that we can just decide not to display a certain column. So because it's approved comments, we don't need to show whether or not they're flagged. We know that they're not flagged. And then this is where the magic happens, because this comments list approved lines up with this comments list approved task that we created. So by putting in this slug as the task, that's all Airplane needs to know how to pull data in. So if we save this and we head back to our studio and click on this content moderation dashboard, we're going to see our comment data loaded directly in, and we can see these are our 2 approved comments. So this is why Airplane is so nice. This is what's called a task-backed component, and it takes a huge amount of busy work out of the way. Instead of having to figure out how to query that from an API and then format that data into a table, we just tell Airplane, we want a table, and this is the data that we want you to put in it, and it does the rest. It's really, really nice to work with. Next, let's add another table, and this time we're going to have it display only our flagged comments, so we can save that. And now we've got approved comments up top and flagged comments at the bottom. So this is pretty good, but we don't really want our moderators to have to look at flagged comments unless they're actively reviewing them, because let's be honest, there's going to be some pretty abusive stuff in here. So we want this to be hidden by a checkbox, so moderators have to opt in to see these flagged comments, and that'll help protect a little bit of everybody's mental health. To do that, let's import a type for the checkbox state. We want to import a checkbox component, and then we import use component state, which is going to let us keep track of what the checkbox is doing, whether it's checked or not. To use that, we're going to run use component state, and the checkbox state is what comes back, and we get back an ID and checked. Then above this flag table, we're going to include this checkbox, and we set the ID from the use component state so that we associate this checkbox with the state we're tracking. Then we want to wrap this flag table in a conditional that only shows it when the checkbox is checked. And if we save this and head back over, now we can see our approved comments are visible. We have to check this box to show the flagged comments. And again, that's just going to help our moderators take a little bit less psychic damage as they're trying to do their jobs. Right now, the only thing we can see is information. Our moderators can't actually do anything. So our next step is going to be to add tasks that allow us to flag or approve comments as well as delete them. We'll follow the same process that we used to create these tasks. So we hit plus, hit task, choose SQL. In this case, do a single comment, and we'll choose it as flag. So we're saying what it is and what we're doing. Create that, give it a more descriptive name. And in this case, we need to know which comment we're working with. So we're going to add a parameter. We're going to name this ID and then add a description. And I know that this is an integer, so we'll choose that. And we'll leave it required. Everything else can stay default, so we'll add that. Then down here, we want to choose our demo database, and we'll create our query. In this query, we have a named argument of ID, and this is to keep our query safe from SQL injection and other issues. So we need to add a query argument, and that's going to have to match. So ID, and then then you can see here that it knows that we have params, and it'll autocomplete for us so that we can set in params ID. And that ties this parameter up here, which is part of our task, to this query argument here, which is part of our SQL query, so that we can set a comment ID here and mark it as flagged. And that gets passed all the way through to our SQL query safely. So to check that, let's go in here and we'll grab one of our approved comments, ID number 3, and we'll head over here, put in ID number 3 and execute. And now if we go back to our dashboard, ID number 3 is gone and is now present in our flagged comments. So we'll repeat this process to create a task that allows us to approve a comment. And now if we put in that same ID of 3 and execute task, when we go back out to our moderation dashboard, it's now approved again and missing from our flagged comments. And we'll repeat that process one more time to create a task to delete a comment. And we can test that by, yet again, putting in our ID of 3. We'll execute the task. And now if we look, it's not in approved comments and it's not in our flagged comments either. Now we can reset our database to put us back to our start point. And now we'll have 2 comments approved and 2 flagged. So you can keep testing your tasks and not worrying about how you're doing, because you can always just run this reset comments database to get back to the starting point. As it stands, we could let our moderators run with just this. They can see approved comments, they can see flagged comments, they can grab an ID and then approve, flag, or delete that comment. That's technically enough, but we can do better because Airplane provides something called row actions, which allows us to put these custom buttons here that allow us to take actions. And just like the taskback components, we have the ability to do task-backed row actions, which means we can provide the slug of a task that we want to perform, and the row will give us a button and then perform that task on the given row without very much config at all from us. So to set this up, we add a row actions prop on the table. We provide a slug, which is the action we want to take, in this case, the comment flag. And then we can give it a label, and this is descriptive of what we're going to do. So we're going to call this flag. So if we save this and then head back to our studio and refresh the page, we're going to see that on our approved comments, we now have the ability to flag a comment. So if I hit this button now, it'll mark this as flagged, and then it refreshes. And if I open up this one, it'll show that we've got all of our tables updated and we've effectively flagged this. So let's repeat that process on our flag table. In this case, we want to actually, we're going to allow a moderator to approve the comment if it was flagged by mistake or inaccurately. And we'll also allow them to delete permanently, because once you've looked at an abusive comment, you kind of don't need to see it again. You should just be able to delete it forever. Once that's saved and we've refreshed the page, we can see that now we have approve and delete options for any of these. So I'm going to approve ID number 3, and that works. But note up here that I actually have to refresh the page if I want to see that update reflected. And we can also delete, and that works. So if I refresh the page again, we now have our 2 approved comments and our flagged comment is gone forever. So we'll reset that database. What we need to do next is we need to make sure that both tables update when we perform one of these actions, because we do want this flagging action to cause it to not only update here, which it already does, but to update here as well. And for that to work, we're going to need one more hook, which will allow us to force a refetch. First, we'll import use task query, which brings back, among other things, the ability to refetch a task. And then we're going to run that twice, once for our flagged query and once for our approved query. This will allow us to independently refetch either the flagged or approved task, which is what we're going to want to do in these tables. On approved comments, when we successfully execute the flagging action, we want to refetch the flagged table, which is the other set of data. And then on flagged comments, whenever we approve a comment, we want to refetch that approved database. We don't need to do this when we delete because it doesn't affect the approved database. So now when we click the flag button, it'll not only update this table, but also the other table, which means that as we're working back and forth, it's going to keep data in sync and avoid any confusion or a requirement to refresh the page. So up to this point, we've only been using SQL tasks, but you can do a lot more, including JavaScript. So let's create a new task and choose JavaScript from the list. You can also use Python shell, GraphQL, REST, or Docker. Lots and lots of options here. And this time we want to be able to create a comment. We're going to name this one comment add, and we're going to use TypeScript. You can also choose JavaScript if you prefer. Let's give it a human readable name as well as a description. And in this one, we need to keep track of the comment, and this is going to be long text. Under the build section, we want to attach a resource. We are going to use the demo DB. Back in our code editor, we've got a new file called commentadd.airplane.ts. This is going to be our task. We can see that it is exporting a task, and it's got the boilerplate that we would expect in the YAML. So a slug, a name, description, and then it's got our parameter details as well as the resource that we're going to use. And down here, it passes an async function that contains whatever we want to do with our particular task. So this part won't need to be edited, but let's replace this entire function with our own code here. So the first thing we want to do is get that comment that we defined out of the parameters. And then we're going to want to check the output to see whether or not it needs to be flagged, but we'll get to that in the next step. So next we're going to use the Airplane built-in SQL so that we can run a query, and we'll insert our new comment into the demo DB using named arguments of comment and flag. And then we will log that response, output a message, and return something that says what the message was and whether or not our comment was flagged. Now, because this is currently hard-coded, nothing will ever get flagged, but it's enough for us to test. So here we've got the input and we can say this is a new comment and execute that task. It says that it's running and it worked. Now, if we head to our dashboard, we can see that new comment.
Moderation is not optional when you're opening up an online space for public comments. People are not going to hang around if they're getting harassed or generally seeing a bunch of terrible behavior. There are enormous challenges with online moderation, and they're far too complex to try to cover in one video. So in this video, we're going to narrow down our focus to just two specific challenges. First, human moderators are the reason that we don't see the absolute worst comments online. But for them to do their job, they have to read that awful mess. Moderators are forced to stare down the absolute worst the web has to offer. It's not an easy job. Seriously, please take care of your mods. They absorb so much psychic damage for our sake. Second, we can't show comments publicly without moderation. We don't want to put our mods under aggressive time constraints, and also, we don't want there to be so much lag between a comment being posted and going public that it takes the momentum out of conversation. To partially address this, we'll use AI as a first line of defense against abusive comments. All right, now hold up. Before we continue, let me add a giant flashing asterisk to everything I'm about to say. AI has huge open ethical questions. Human bias makes its way into these models, and so we have to be extremely careful with how we use these models, and we need to make sure that a human is checking all of this work. Our use case is to use AI to catch as much hateful and abusive content as we can to help our moderators work more efficiently. It is not a replacement for human moderators. Cool? Cool, let's build it.
Airplane has built-in support for AI that's compatible with OpenAI or Anthropic. And for this particular use case, we're going to be taking advantage of OpenAI. So we can head over to openai.com. You can log in or sign up. Once you get logged in, choose this API option, and then we can head up to our username, view API keys, and then create a new secret key. And you can call this whatever you want. We'll call it Airplane Dev. And this is going to give you a new secret key, which we can then copy. Now that we've got that API key, we can head back over to our studio and under config, hit this plus button. We need to call this OpenAI API key, and then we can paste in that API key that we just got. Just as a heads up, this is going to create a new file called airplane.dev.yaml, and it stores that API key for local use in plain text. So make sure you don't commit this airplane.dev.yaml if you're using any API keys, because this will end up on GitHub, and that can be a huge problem if you accidentally commit secrets into a public space or even just into source control. Now that that config's set, we can use it in add comment. So we're going to go down to the build section here, and we will add an environment variable from config, and we're going to choose OpenAI API key, give it the same name here. And now that's available to us in our JavaScript. We look at the top of the JavaScript, we can see that it's available here. With the API key in place, we can actually check our output, which we will do by adding this get sentiment function. And so this calls the airplane.ai function, which means we can just provide a prompt here. So what we're saying is identify abusive and vulgar comments. Negative opinions, like I don't like this, are allowed, but personal attacks are not. So you can't call somebody names, but you can disagree with them. We provide then an array of example output. So we want the input to be the comment and the output to be what the shape of it should be. So we want to check whether or not it's flagged and what the sentiment was. So we provide one that is allowed, we provide one that is not allowed, then we provide one that is negative but allowed, like having an opinion that is potentially disagreeing with the author. Next, we grab the value of a weight get sentiment, and that's going to give us our output, which will map this shape. Confidence is a value between 0 and 1 that lets us know how sure the AI is that it's correct. To actually use this, let's replace that message. We'll include the sentiment in there to let somebody know whether they came across as positive or negative. And then we'll check if they're flagged. And if they are flagged, we're going to chide them because we're not going to show their comment. So if they aren't flagged, we'll let them know that their comment was saved. But if they are flagged, then we're just going to let them know, hey, that's not okay. And we just want to make sure that the confidence is high on that, or else we risk false positives. So once we save this, now when we come back, we can add a new comment and we can say, wow, this is great. And when we run it, what comes back is a note that the comment was saved, the sentiment was positive, and it's not flagged. But if we run it again and we say something mean, it'll come back and let us know that our comment was flagged and, give us a little reminder that maybe we should be nicer on the internet. So this is very little code. It's about 25 lines of code, and this gives us a pretty solid first line on auto moderation. Now, remember, AI is not a replacement for human moderation. This is just a first line of defense, and it's meant to protect the moderators and help them work more efficiently, not replace them outright. At this point, we're ready to deploy, so we can head over to the Airplane library. That's at app.airplane.dev/library. Here we want to create a new config variable. I've already done it to create the OpenAI API key. And just as a tip, you should probably set a separate API key for OpenAI as production so that you've got one for dev and one for production, just in case. With the config variable set, we're ready to deploy, so we can go to our command line and run airplane deploy. We do want to deploy to the default environment, and this will take a minute or so. Once it's deployed, you can click through to see your deployments, or you can just head right over to your library and it's going to show you everything that you just built. So we've got our comment moderation dashboard here. And as a little trick, I like to star it because then it shows up right here to make it easier to find. Now we've got our comments here for moderation ready to roll. Now, if you're working on a production app and using your production database to build this moderation dashboard, you're done. But if you want to see how this might work in a real app, we also have this example app here. This is just a little Astro site that'll show us everything that's running. To get this running, first we need an API key for Airplane, which we get through the CLI. So we run Airplane API keys create and then give it a name. So example app. That will give us this API key here. So once we've got that API key, we want to duplicate this .env.example as .env, copy this API key and drop this in. And then we can move into the example app, install dependencies, npm run dev. And now we open up localhost 3000. We'll see our little app. So this is a content post, and down at the bottom, we've got the ability to leave comments. And you can see this is pulling our live comments out of the Airplane demo database. If I try to add a new comment, I can say something like, I freaking love fried chicken. It holds while we check for potty mouth and then gives us back a note. Comment was saved. That is positive. Then let's try this again. And we can try, you can do even sneaky stuff gets caught here. And this is what's so cool. So a little trigger warning here because I'm about to use an acronym that is, that indicates self-harm. But look how smart this is, because if I say, I think you should, and then you do an acronym like that and submit, it's smart enough to catch that. And I think that's really impressive. Again, it's not a replacement for humans, but boy, is that a nice way to feel at least somewhat confident that the worst of the worst is not going to make it to your public comments.
You don't need a ton of time or a ton of code to build great internal tooling. Huge thanks to Airplane for making this video possible. Head over to airplane.dev to create an account and start building internal tools. Now, please go set up an internal dashboard so your team can stop copy pasting super admin commands in production.